Welcome to Psalms Layer by Layer, a project of Cambridge Digital Bible Research. In this video, we will walk through the top 3 exegetical issues in Psalm 22. These are issues that any interpreter of the psalm, whether they're reading the text in Hebrew or looking at a number of translations, is likely to encounter, and each of these issues impacts how one understands the meaning of the psalm as a whole. In Psalm 22, the top 3 issues are all basically textual issues, meaning that the issues are not first and foremost about how to interpret and translate the text, but about which text to interpret and translate. There's a textual issue in verse 9, a textual issue in verse 17, and a textual issue in verse 30, which either talks about a life being saved or a life being lost. The first issue is in verse 9. In this verse, the psalmist's enemies taunt him and say that God will not rescue him. The NIV represents the enemy's words as follows: "He trusts in the Lord," they say. "Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him." The NET, however, gives the enemy's words a little differently, and as you can see, we've basically agreed with this position. The NET says, "They say, commit yourself to the Lord. Let the Lord rescue him. Let the Lord deliver him, for he delights in him." Notice that in the NIV, the first clause is a statement of fact. He trusts in the Lord. And notice that in the NET, the first clause is imperative. Trust in the Lord, or commit yourself to the Lord. The disagreement between the NIV and the NET is representative of the disagreement among modern translations generally. Some translations align with the NIV, he trusts the Lord, and others align with the NET, trust in the Lord. The difference between the two readings is a single vowel. The traditional Hebrew text of Psalm 22:9, the Masoretic text, reads, "Gol el Adonai yefalatehu, yatzilehu ki chafetz bo." The first word, gol, is an imperative, and the clause, "Gol el Adonai," means something like trust in the Lord, or as the NET puts it, commit yourself to the Lord. By using an imperative, then, the NET and others reflect the Masoretic text. If, however, we change the vowel of the first word to read gal instead of gol, then the verb becomes indicative. He trusts, or he has trusted in the Lord. The NIV and others reflect this vocalization of the Hebrew text. In order to determine which vocalization, which vowel is correct, we can turn first to the ancient translations of Psalm 22 to see how they vocalize the Hebrew text. When we look at these translations, the Greek Septuagint, the Syriac Peshitta, and Jerome's Latin translation from the Hebrew text, we see that all of them read the verb as an indicative. He trusts. Apparently they vocalize their Hebrew text as gal instead of gul. The indicative reading then has very early and strong support. Another argument against the imperative reading gol and for the indicative reading gal is the fact that the very phrase gol el Adonai or gol al Adonai occurs elsewhere in the Bible, in Psalms and in Proverbs. It's possible that the Masoretes or some earlier scribe was accidentally influenced by one of these other passages, and so he wrote gol where he should have written gal. Another argument in favor of the indicative gal is the use of the third person throughout the verse. The indicative gal is third person, and so it fits well along with the other third person references to the psalmist in this verse. He trusts in the Lord, they say. Let the Lord rescue him. Let him deliver him, since he delights in him. By contrast, if we vocalize the first word as an imperative, gol, then this second person form does not fit so well in the context. You commit it to the Lord. Let the Lord rescue him. Let the Lord deliver him, because he is pleased with him. Now, person shifting from one line to the next is very common in Hebrew poetry. The difficulty here is that the person shift occurs within a single line. You commit it to the Lord, let the Lord rescue him. There are, however, some other examples of abrupt person shifting within a single line. In the poem in Genesis 49, for example, Jacob says to Reuben, "Unstable as water you shall not have preeminence. Because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it, he went up to my couch." The last line of the verse has a shift from second person to third person. And it could be that we're looking at the same phenomenon in Psalm 22:9. The rare nature of this phenomenon, person shifting within a single line, could explain why the ancient versions all read an indicative here. Not wanting to see an abrupt person shift, they vocalize the verb as third person indicative to match the other third person references in this verse. We conclude then that the more difficult, imperative reading of the Masoretic text is likely original. In this verse, the psalmist's enemies taunt him directly, telling him to trust in the Lord, perhaps even quoting to him the words of the proverb, "Commit your work to the Lord." If asked to rate our level of confidence in this interpretation on a scale of A to D, A being the highest, D being the lowest, we would give this interpretation a B rating. The second issue for Psalm 22, another textual issue, is found in verse 17, and this is probably the most difficult of the three issues. We've translated the last line of this verse as, "They have pierced my hands and my feet." This translation is virtually identical to that of the ESV, which says, "They have pierced my hands and feet." The JPS 85 translation, on the other hand, says, "Dogs surround me, a pack of evil ones closes in on me. Like lions, they maul my hands and feet." The difference between these two readings, "like lions" versus "they have pierced," as with the previous issue, has to do with a single Hebrew vowel sound. The Masoretic text says, "Ka'ari yadai v'raglai." The word ka'ari means "like the lion." The kaf is a preposition meaning like, and the noun ari refers to a lion. So the Masoretic text translates, as the JPS 85 has it, "Dogs surround me, a pack of evil ones closes in on me, like lions. They maul my hands and feet." The verb "they maul" is not actually in the text, as the brackets of the JPS 85 translation indicate, but seems to be implied. Literally, the text reads, "Like the lion, my hands and feet." The reason why the ESV, along with other English translations, say "they pierced my hands and feet" instead of "like the lion" is because they're reading a verb here, the verb ka'aru, instead of the noun prepositional phrase ka'ari. The reason why the ESV, along with other English translations, say "they pierced my hands and feet" is because they're reading a verb here, the verb ka'aru, instead of the prepositional phrase ka'ari. And there are good reasons for reading a verb here. First of all, the earliest Hebrew manuscript of Psalm 22, the Psalm scroll from Nachal Hever, reads the verb ka'aru. Similarly, the Septuagint, the oldest translation of Psalm 22, has a verb here, which suggests that their Hebrew manuscript read, like the Nachal Hever scroll, ka'aru. Likewise, all of the subsequent ancient translations, with the exception of the Aramaic Targum, which is relatively late, read a verb here, ka'aru, and not ka'ari. It's obvious that the two words look very similar, and it's easy to see how a scribe might have accidentally written one instead of the other. The question is, which one is the accident, and which one is original? The manuscript evidence might suggest that ka'aru is the earlier reading, since this reading shows up centuries before the reading ka'ari. Furthermore, lions show up a couple of other times in Psalm 22. The word aryeh, another word for lion, similar to ari, appears in verse 14 and in verse 22. It could be that the presence of lions elsewhere in the psalm influenced the scribe to see a lion here in verse 17 as well. For these reasons, we've concluded that the reading lion, ka'ari, is probably secondary, and that the earlier reading is probably the verb ka'aru. But now we have to make sense of ka'aru. It looks like a verb, but what verb is it? What does it mean? The problem is that the root kaf, aleph, resh occurs nowhere else in the Bible, and so its meaning is unclear. Most of the modern translations we consulted translate it as "they pierced," but some others translate it as "they bound." Some translate it as "they hacked off," and others say "my hands and feet have shriveled." The ancient versions show a similar diversity. The Septuagint has "they dug," which may be similar in this context to "pierced." The Peshitta has "they pierced," and Jerome and the Greek revisers have "they bound." The Septuagint's translation might give us a clue to the interpretation of this word. The Greek word orixan means "they dug," and the Septuagint often uses this word to translate the verb kara, which in the third person plural is karu, a Hebrew word which refers to the act of digging. It could be, then, that the Septuagint translators understood ka'aru simply as another way to spell the word karu, which comes from the root kaf, resh, he, though it might also come in this case from a hollow root kaf, vav, resh. In either case, the meaning would be the same. The verb would mean something here like "they dug" or "they dug out." We see similar variations in spelling elsewhere. In Zechariah 14:10, for example, we find the form vra'amah with an aleph, which is a variation, perhaps a dialectical variation, of v'ramah. So it could be that the verb in Psalm 22:17 is not actually from a root kaf aleph resh, but from the root kaf resh he, or from the hollow root kaf vav resh, and that it means to dig out or to dig through. And in this context, where the object of digging through is hands and feet, it might mean more specifically to pierce, as the Peshitta and most modern translations seem to have understood it. The meaning pierce works well when we consider this verse in the wider context of the poem. Some of the images in verses 13 to 22 are arranged chiastically. Verse 13, for example, mentions bulls followed by lions in verse 14. This is mirrored in verse 22, which mentions lions and oxen in the reverse order. Similarly, verse 21 mentions a sword and dogs, while our verse 17, mentions dogs and then the verb ka'aru. If ka'aru means they pierced, then it would correspond well with the mention of a sword in verse 21. In conclusion, then, we follow the majority of modern translations which interpret this verse to say, they dug through my hands and feet, or more specifically in this context, they pierced my hands and feet. We give this interpretation a C rating. While we have some confidence that the original text read some verb, ka'aru, we're less confident about what this verb means or which root it comes from. The final issue, another textual issue, or rather a cluster of textual issues, is in verse 30. We've translated this verse as, all of the strong ones of the earth have eaten and worshipped, all of those going down to dust will kneel before him, that is, he will not have preserved his life. The ESV translation is similar. It translates the final two lines of this verse as, before him shall bow all who go down to the dust, even the one who could not keep himself alive. The NRSV, on the other hand, says, before him shall bow all who go down to the dust, and I shall live for him. Now, the first of these lines is identical in both translations, but the last line is radically different in each. According to the ESV, the last line elaborates on the previous line. It further describes those who will bow down before the Lord. That is, all those going down to the dust, including the one who could not keep himself alive. According to the NRSV, however, the last line is not about those going down to the dust, but about the psalmist himself. I shall live for him, he says. How do we end up with such different translations? The Masoretic text reads for this last line, V'nafsho lo chiyah. This is the text that the ESV is translating when it says, even the one who could not keep himself alive. Most other modern translations also reflect the Masoretic text here. The NIV, for example, says, all who go down to the dust will kneel before him, those who cannot keep themselves alive. Some translations, however, like the NRSV and the New English Bible, say, and I shall live for him. This translation reflects 3 points of disagreement with the Masoretic text. First, instead of nafsho, his soul or himself, these translations want to read nafshi, my soul. Secondly, instead of the negative particle lo, these translations want to read a lamed preposition with a third masculine singular suffix, lo. Finally, these changes require that the PL verb chiyah be revocalized either to a kal verb chaya or to the adjective chaya. And if you accept these 3 changes to the text, then you end up with a translation like that of the NRSV. I, nafshi, literally my soul, is alive, chaya, for him, lo. The NRSV gives us a footnote where they cite as evidence for their decision the Septuagint, the Syriac translation, and Jerome's Latin translation. The Septuagint translation and the Syriac translation both say, my soul lives for him. Jerome's Latin translation is mixed. While he agrees with the Septuagint in reading for him instead of not, he agrees with the Masoretic text in reading his soul instead of my soul. The reading my soul, nafshi, is somewhat difficult in the context. Ever since verse 27, there's been no first-person language. Instead, verses 27 to 30 have been mostly third-person. They're about the Lord and about those coming to worship the Lord. So a first-person suffix at the end of verse 30 seems unlikely. And if we read nafsho instead of nafshi, then a third-person suffix lo also seems unlikely, since it's not clear who the lo would be referring to, or what the clause as a whole would mean. The reading of the Masoretic text seems to make the best sense in the context. The previous line has just talked about those who go down to the dust, and now this line explains what it means to go down to the dust. It means being mortal, not being able to preserve one's life. As the NIV translates it, all who go down to the dust will kneel before him, those who cannot keep themselves alive. Now, a potential problem with this view is that while those who go down to the dust is plural, the suffix on nafsho is singular. It seems unlikely that a singular suffix would have a plural noun phrase as its antecedent, but this kind of number mismatch does happen elsewhere. Micah 2:9, for example, says that the women of my people you drive out from their delightful houses. The phrase, the women of my people, neshei ami, is plural, while the suffix on delightful houses, which the ESV translates as their, is actually singular. In this case, the singular suffix might be distributive, each one of the women. So also in Psalm 22:30, the singular suffix on nafsho probably refers back to the phrase, all those who go down to the dust, and the suffix might be distributive, each one of them, that is, each one of those going down to the dust, has not preserved his life. In other words, the last line of verse 30 further explains what it means to go down to the dust. It means to die, to not preserve your life. We give this interpretation a C rating. How we resolve each of these exegetical issues shapes how we see the psalm as a whole. In verse 9, the psalmist's enemies taunt him, and they don't just talk about him behind his back. Instead, they hurl insults directly at him. Thinking that the Lord has abandoned him, they tell him to his face mockingly, "Trust in the Lord," so that the Lord can save him. In verse 17, the suffering psalmist describes his surrounding enemies as a pack of dogs and as a company of evildoers. At the end of verse 17, he says that this company of evildoers has dug through or pierced his hands and his feet. The image of piercing corresponds in the poetic structure to the sword imagery later in the psalm. The psalmist's enemies have surrounded him with swords and pierced his hands and feet, thus taking from him the ability to run away or to defend himself. And in this section of the psalm, it seems as though the psalmist is as good as dead. But by the end of the psalm, the Lord has answered the psalmist and rescued him from his enemies. In response, the psalmist throws a banquet, and he summons the nations of the earth to come and eat and worship the Lord. Everyone is invited, and everyone is called to bow the knee to the Lord, both the strong ones of the earth and the weak ones who go down to the dust. That is, those who can't keep themselves alive. In other words, everyone, strong and weak, is summoned to worship the Lord and to celebrate what he has done for the psalmist. This has been the Exegetical Issues video for Psalm 22, in which we explore the difficult and important issues that interpreters of the psalm are likely to encounter. Our overview video provides a coherent interpretation of the psalm, and our poetic features video explores the natively Hebrew poetic nature of the psalm. All these videos are offered free of charge thanks to the generosity of our donors. Please visit us at cdbr.org to learn more.